Mike Portnoy is one of my favorite drummers. He used to be with Dream Theater for a long time, and he's done a million different side projects. And since the pandemic started, I've noticed that he's posted a series of videos going through his collection of albums, not just the ones with which he's been involved, but some of his favorites from Rush, Marillion, Led Zeppelin, Genesis. And it's been really fun to watch him go down memory lane and talk about the albums that influenced his youth. I have zero musical ability, none. I screwed around with the bass for a couple years, but I wasn't very good at it. I do, however, fancy myself a decent writer, hopefully not terrible. And I thought that I'd kind of go in Mike's direction here and go through my own canon of books. Let's rock. The first one is Why New Systems Fail, and I wrote this at the end of 2008 while I was on a consulting project in New York City. And quite frankly, I didn't even know if I could do it. I had a couple of friends who had written some books, and I was really curious to see if I could pull this off. And I did. I spent a lot of time scribbling down my thoughts, and I self-published this book through Author House. You can see the cover here is not fantastic. Even the insides of the book really aren't terribly professional. And the book came out in February, I think February 4th of 2009, if memory serves. And for 5 months, nothing happened. I spent 3 of those months paying an exorbitant sum of money to a PR firm that ultimately did very little. To be fair, I didn't really have a track record as an author, and that was one of the reasons that I self-published it. I knew that given the state of the economy at the time, there weren't a lot of publishers who were going to take a chance on a first-time author who never sold a book in his life. Oh, and by the way, this book is about implementing new information systems, and companies really weren't doing that in the midst of the Great Recession. So the book, as I said, did nothing for months and months, and I had all the time in the world, and I spent a decent amount of time sending copies to basically anyone who'd have one. And then in July of 2009, I remember that the book all of a sudden started blowing up. My Google alerts, boom, boom, boom. And a guy by the name of Bruce Webster recommended the book and in fact endorsed it on a little site called Slashdot. And before you know it, my book started ratcheting up the scales of the Amazon bestseller list. And I remember peaking at number 91. Back then I was a PC user, and on the internet browser at the time, I was hitting F5 over and over, and the number kept going down. For those of you who don't necessarily know much about the publishing world, down is good. You're much better off being number 1 than number 1,000,000. And I peaked at number 91, which in a way was kind of a curse because I may never get to that number again, and that's okay. Kind of like Pearl Jam's first album, 10. Amazing album. They probably have not created anything nearly as good again, but again, I've got no musical ability, so who am I to judge? And on the basis of that week, I think I sold something like 600 books, and all of a sudden, traditional publishers sensed an opportunity. So I remember that Cengage reached out to me to do a second edition of the book, and this one is much more professional than the first. I can't compare it to the first one. I added some new material. It's much more professional, not just the cover, but the insides. It's a much more professional treatment. And again, in hindsight, I look back and think I'm a much better writer than back then, but this is a quantum leap for me. And this book, again, did reasonably well. And I want to say it came out in April of 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Around the same time, I took a chance and I sent a manuscript for an idea to Wiley on a second book, or I should say a pitch for a manuscript. And even though typically acquisition editors throw those into the slush pile, basically the garbage, because who are you? Ironically, a guy by the name of Tim Burgard at Wiley said, yeah, we'd like to do it. And this became my second book, The Next Wave of Technologies. And this is what they call a survey book, which means that kind of like a military officer or soldier surveying the territory. This book covers a lot of terrain, but not terribly deeply. And I reached out to 14 or 15, I forget, different experts on different topics. And I asked them to write a chapter about mobile technologies or about master data management with my friend Dalton Servo, also a big Rush fan. And chapters on risk management and all sorts of different topics here. And to this day, I believe this is my longest book. It comes in at a little over 400 pages and, you know, costs a lot of money, and I don't love the cover. This is my only cover that my friend Luke Fletcher didn't do, or at least advise me on. And they charged a lot of money. They didn't really do a lot of promotional activity. I remember when I was looking through Business Week and saw an ad for a Wiley offer, and I contacted this guy Tim and said, could we please do an ad in Business Week? And he said, absolutely. And I was all full of piss and vinegar. And he said, sure, we can do that. And he gave me the person's name at Business Week, and it became obvious to me that I was going to have to market the book and pay for that ad myself. So it made me wonder, really, what was a traditional publisher doing? That led me to my third book, The New Small, and I actually had turned down Wiley on this one, and I started my own little publishing company called Motion Publishing, and Motion did 6 books. I'll come back to some of those in a minute, but for this one, I did all of the marketing myself, but unlike the first book, Why New Systems Fail, or I should say the first version, I found proper editors and cover designers. In fact, Luke Fletcher came with me on this one, and interior designers and indexers, some of whom had worked with me at Wiley. So this book, even though it's through my own little publishing company, is much more professional than Why New Systems Fail. And this book did reasonably well. I certainly learned a few lessons along the way, but I gained the knowledge and the experience of having done a book myself that made me confident that if I wanted to keep doing books through my own little company, I could produce something that's every bit as professional as the one from Wiley, the next wave of technologies. That led me to, and by the way, The New Small came out in, I think, November of 2010. I wrote that one pretty quickly. As I said, the economy wasn't great then. I was starting to make inroads as a speaker, but the consulting work was really drying up, and I knew that I wanted to get into a different field. And I started writing based on my experience of the previous book about bigger companies, particularly the ones that have been so influential in my lifetime. And if I absolutely had to work for a big company, which one would it be and why? And I came up with Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, and subsequently that became the age of the platform, another book with Motion Publishing. This one did really well, and quite frankly, took me to that next level. I had an agent at the time who told me to go with more of a traditional publisher, but they wanted to wait 1.5 years. And quite frankly, I'm not that smart. I was not the only person talking about Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google, nor was I the only person realizing the importance of a platform as a business model. So this book, again, did really well. It won an award. It sold a bunch of copies. To this date, it's my best-selling book. Hopefully it won't be for long, but we'll get to that in a bit. And again, just took me to a different level. I started writing for Inc. magazine, started getting keynote talks. Again, the economy was improving then. This book came out in, I want to say, November of 2011. I started writing for Inc. magazine. Because I did it through Motion Publishing, I could get speaking gigs. And even if the conference didn't have a proper budget for speakers, I'd say, well, how about giving every attendee a book? So I'd negotiate a deal for that. And again, this book did really well, so much so that I started pitching foreign rights, and a publisher in India, Embassy Books, created the Indian version of this, even though it's in English. Amazon does not, or at least did not back then, have a huge imprint in India. So this book did really well, and this was one translation. There were some other translations. This is the Malaysian version, which ironically is a lot thicker. Again, I don't speak Malaysian, so for all I know, it could read Phil as an idiot over and over again, and I wouldn't know. But again, getting translated into a foreign language was certainly a moment of pride for me. I could corrupt people who lived halfway across the globe. And then there actually got to be a Korean version of this. I spoke in Seoul, South Korea in 2012, and they had some copies of this book. Again, I can't read it all, any of it. I do recognize a few of the pictures from the book, so I'm pretty sure they didn't write Phil is a moron over and over again, but again, another translation of this book. Around that time, when I wrote for Dataflux, which was a subsidiary of SAS, we turned a bunch of the blog posts from the Data Roundtable about data management and data quality into a book through Motion Publishing, and that became 101 Light Bulb Moments. And I served as the editor, and I think 30 or 40 of my blog posts are in that book, give or take. But we were able to produce a book through Motion. So I'd taken Motion about as far as I could, and around 2012, I started hearing more about the term big data. And even though I went away from Wiley and traditional publishers, I didn't burn any bridges. And when I reached out to Tim Berger at Wiley again to do a book about big data at the end of 2012, I said, look, I'll come back, but we got to get this thing out quickly because everyone's talking about big data. And if we wait too long, it'll be like writing a social media book in 2016. That ship has sailed. So I wound up writing Too Big to Ignore. This one came out in, I want to say March of 2013. And even though it didn't do as well as The Age of the Platform, it earned out, which is a fancy way of saying that my book earned more than the advance royalties. So I started receiving additional money from the book. And again, it continued my momentum. I was able to keep doing keynote talks. And this book actually also got translated into Chinese. Again, I don't speak Chinese, but from what I understand, this is Chinese. In addition to that, there is a Korean version of this book. So this was my first book to get translated into 2 foreign language. And they also turned this book into a paperback version at my request a few years later, because I thought, well, there were some mistakes, and hardcover books are very expensive. Most people don't care. So why not do a paperback book? And they agreed. So that was the Korean version of Too Big to Ignore, my book on big data. I started thinking after that book came out about how most people are not terribly technical. They're end users, right? They're more application experts, but they're not programmers. So how would people make sense of big data? And they would use data visualization tools like Tableau, and later Microsoft Power BI. And I wound up writing The Visual Organization, and this came out in, I think, April, of 2014. And the premise of this book is that the tools now are much more powerful than they used to be, and you can drag and drop without being a programmer and create interactive visualizations of the data that allow you to effectively have a conversation. You don't need to go to the IT department to ask and answer a bunch of questions and go back and forth and get frustrated. This is my first book in color, and it looks really good. I remember fawning over it for maybe 45 minutes when I lived in Las Vegas. And after that said, all right, don't get too big of a head. And I immediately went to a driving range 5 minutes from my home, and within 5 minutes was frustrated at my golf swing. So that very much kept me grounded. Wiley also was able to get this book translated into Chinese a couple years later. Again, I don't understand any of it, but it is in color and it looks great. I assume that it did okay, but this was another one of my books in the SAS series. At the end of 2014, I was starting to think about all these tools and technologies, and if you couldn't explain them very well, then they were effectively useless. And I had paid a lot of attention to the jargon of a lot of these software vendors and consultants, and it really frustrated me. And I thought a lot about a book about business communication and how much jargon we used, how frequently people relied upon email as opposed to a truly collaborative tool like Slack or Asana or Basecamp or Yammer. And I wound up writing, again with Wiley, Message Not Received. This book also won an award. It did all right. Not great, but particularly proud of this book. And I joke that if I didn't write this book, I would have needed to see a psychiatrist because all the buzzwords in email were really frustrating me. This book also got translated into Chinese. I don't really recognize many of the symbols. Again, I don't speak the language, but it was nice to know that there were people across the globe who were reading what I had to write. And then that book came out in March of 2015, if memory serves me correctly. And I didn't write anything in 2016, but in 2017, I started working on this book, Analytics the Agile Way. At the time, I was a professor at Arizona State teaching the capstone course on enterprise analytics. And the book that we used for that course was, quite frankly, terrible. It was embarrassing to use. I won't slam the author by name, but I knew I could do a better job and wrote the manuscript for this book in about a month and was able to use this for my capstone course. And again, the course went much better because we had a foundation for that particular class. In February, I want to say, of 2019, I found out that Harvard Business Review was going to be excerpting a piece from that book in this book called Agile. It's from the series, and there are 7 or 8 pages from my book, Analytics the Agile Way, in it, but this book puts me in some pretty esteemed company. For example, Jeff Sutherland, the founder of Scrum, the most popular Agile technique, wrote a chapter in this as well. So again, I was proud to be a part of this one. And my 2 latest creations are Slack for Dummies, my second book in color. Not that you can tell here, but here you go, yellow. And this one came out in, well, the ebook came out in May of 2020, and the physical book I got in June. And I'm particularly proud of this one. Interesting side story. I had to write this book twice. I wrote it after I signed the contract and was finished with it in, I want to say, November of 2019. And then I found out that Slack was blowing up its user interface. So I had to rewrite 70% of the book so it wouldn't come out and be dead on arrival. And then because I did, in the publisher's eyes, a good job of doing Slack for Dummies, they reached out to me to do Zoom for Dummies with the provision that I bang out this book really quickly. This book is not in color, but early sales are very strong. I found out a few days ago that there's already going to be a German and a Dutch translation of this book, and they already sold 5,000 copies within the first few weeks, which again is pretty rare. Most books don't sell that many copies. And that, so far, is my canon of work, my 10 books and some translations and a few side projects. And hopefully I've got more in me, but we'll see what the future holds. Thanks.